Stop. Don't scroll past this. On the final day of 2025, while headlines were celebrating the new year, while most people were distracted, the system did something it didn't want you to notice. Something every person earning money, holding savings, or trusting a bank needs to understand right now. December 31st, 2025, exactly 5 p.m. As markets were closing, as America was checking out for the night, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York quietly injected $74.6 billion into the banking system, overnight, through a mechanism most people have never even heard of. And here's the part that should stop you cold. That wasn't the first time. It wasn't even the second. This wasn't an anomaly. It was a pattern, a sequence of emergency liquidity injections that started on Halloween night 2025. Accelerated through November, surged in December, and didn't stop when the calendar flipped. It carried straight into 2026, which means this isn't support, it's a shift. Because whether they say it or not, the Fed has already turned. After 3.5 years of draining liquidity out of the financial system, they've quietly started putting it back in. Not loudly, not transparently, quietly. They've wrapped it in technical language, dressed it up in boring terminology, hoping you'll hear the words but miss the meaning. But here, you're going to see exactly what it really is. Because once you understand the pattern behind what's happening right now, you won't look at your bank account, your savings, or your financial future the same way again. Follow me. What I'm about to show you, this has happened before. Every time it follows the same sequence. Every time it ends the same way. And right now, we're not at the beginning. We're already deep inside the cycle. Start with a number, $74.6 billion. That's what Wall Street banks needed in a single overnight loan on December 31st, 2025. A record. And then the finale, $74.6 billion. All collateralized. All happening in the shadows, through the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And here's what matters most. They removed the limit. No caps. No ceilings. Borrow whatever you need, as Jerome Powell said, economically appropriate. But systems don't remove limits when things are stable. They do it when pressure is building. This isn't routine. This is stress. Because the standing repo facility, this emergency window, is supposed to be a last resort, unused for years. Then suddenly used at record levels, twice. That tells you one thing. Private liquidity is gone. Banks aren't finding cash in the market anymore. They're going straight to the Fed. And this isn't an event. It's a pattern. Stage 1 was already completed. Years of tightening, over $2.4 trillion drained since 2022. Now, something is starting to break. And that's how every liquidity cycle begins. When reserves drain, the margin for error disappears. Banks stop lending and start hoarding. Short-term funding becomes fragile. Every quarter end, every tax date becomes a stress point. That's exactly what happened through 2024 into 2025. Reserves fell from over $3.3 trillion to $2.8 trillion. Sounds large until you realize post-2008 rules demand far more. Pressure built. Repo rates surged. By October 31st, 2025, funding stress was already flashing red. Then came the shift. The Fed didn't taper tightening, they ended it. Immediately, then quietly began buying treasuries again, $40 billion per month. Not QE, but functionally the same. After 3.5 years of draining $2.4 trillion, they reversed. Not because of the economy, but because the system couldn't function without support. This is Stage 3, loss of control. Private liquidity fails. The Fed becomes the system. And Stage 4? It always follows the same path. Short-term relief, deeper structural cracks, inflation returns, confidence breaks. Inject too little, the system freezes. Inject too much, inflation explodes. That's the trap, and we're already inside it. The 2007-2008 crisis didn't begin with headlines. It began in the shadows inside the repo market. Before anyone noticed, liquidity vanished. Collateral became questionable. Lenders pulled back, and just like that, funding froze. Banks couldn't roll short-term debt. Overnight lending collapsed. Then came the names everyone remembers: Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers. But by then, the system had already broken. The Fed stepped in emergency facilities, bailouts, balance sheet expansion from under $1 trillion to over $2.3 trillion. Because once repo fails, everything fails, and Japan. That's what happens after the rescue works. Rates to zero, then negative. Balance sheet above 100% of GDP. Decades of dependency. No exit. Every attempt to normalize triggers instability. Now look at today. Since 2022, $2.4 trillion drained, reserves falling, stress building. Then 2025 cracks appear, repo pressure, banks hoarding cash. And now? The Fed has reversed. Liquidity is back. Limits are gone. This is stage 3, controlled collapse. Not failure, but dependence. And once a system crosses that line, it doesn't go back. Listen, this is the part they won't say out loud. The Federal Reserve didn't end quantitative tightening early because everything was fine. They ended it because the system couldn't handle it. Reserves fell too low. The repo market started to crack. Warning signals were already flashing, so they had two choices: let the system break or pivot. They chose to pivot, which means every dollar they inject today didn't exist yesterday. Every $40 billion in treasury purchases is new liquidity entering the system. After draining $2.4 trillion, they stopped because they had to. Now they're putting it back. And here's the deeper layer. The US government needs constant buyers for its debt. With national debt above $38 trillion and interest over $1 trillion annually, the system depends on demand. But banks can't absorb it like before. So the Fed steps in, not just to stabilize markets, but to keep the system funded. That's fiscal dominance. And for you, inflation doesn't disappear, it gets delayed. Rates stay higher for longer. And the dollar? Under pressure. This isn't theory anymore. It's already happening. They'll tell you the system is stronger, better capitalized, more tools, more control. And none of that is wrong. But none of it changes the outcome. Because when you pull $2.4 trillion out of a system that depends on constant liquidity, you don't create stability, you create fragility. And once that fragility shows up in the repo market, you don't have choices anymore. You have consequences. They'll tell you the dollar is protected, that the world has no alternative. But look closer. Foreign central banks are diversifying. The dollar's share of global reserves is falling, slowly then faster. This isn't collapse, it's erosion. And every time the Fed steps in, every emergency injection, every balance sheet expansion, that process accelerates. They'll tell you growth will save us, that AI, productivity, innovation will fix the math. Maybe one day, but today? Debt is exploding. Interest costs are over $1 trillion a year. Growth isn't keeping up, so the Fed pivoted. Not by choice, but because they had to. And now? We're in a system that no longer functions without support. Not temporarily, permanently. That's the shift. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. When a central bank's biggest challenge is shrinking itself without breaking the system, you're already in stage 3. And stage 4, it has never, not once in history, ended without pain for savers and investors. The people who understand this early prepare. The ones who dismiss it as too technical always realize too late. Now here's what makes this undeniable. The Fed itself is modeling a severe global recession in its 2026 stress tests: falling asset prices, frozen markets, rising unemployment, prolonged contraction. This isn't theory. This is their baseline worst case at the same time. They're injecting liquidity, removing limits, restarting asset purchases under a different name. That's not coincidence, that's confirmation. Even Fed officials admit the system has a flaw. Regulations that force banks to hoard liquidity, then panic when stress hits, which means when private markets freeze, only one source remains: the Fed. And you? You don't have access to that window. Your money sits inside a system that now depends on constant support to function. This isn't temporary. This is the new structure. So don't panic, but understand where you are, because awareness is where protection begins. Don't be the last person to realize the rules have already changed. The Federal Reserve changed them in November 2025, ending tightening. In December, removing limits and buying treasuries again. On December 31st, $74.6 billion moved overnight. By March 2026, they're openly discussing how to shrink without breaking everything. This isn't routine, it's a turning point, and every time history reaches this moment, the consequences hit far beyond Wall Street. Your savings, your retirement, your purchasing power. The pattern is active. The data is confirmed. The system has changed. Now you know.